Today we will be talking about different ways of graphing in history. You're going to find that this is a great preview for what you're going to be doing in your math classes for the rest of the year. The first type of graph we want to talk about are line plots. A line graph can show an increase or decrease in something over time. Our graph to the right shows us how many African Americans moved to northern states during this increment of time. So from 1900 to 1910, almost 30,000 African Americans moved to Illinois. From 1910 to 1920, we're up closer to 70,000. And then from 1920 to 1930, we have another 120,000. So this is doing a good job showing us how over time these numbers have grown. The next type of graph we want to talk about are circle graphs. Circle graphs help people visualize how different parts make up a whole. This can also be called a pie graph. So the one to our left shows African Americans who migrated to northern states just during the window of 1900 to 1910. You can tell most of our people moved to Michigan. We want to be careful with these circle graphs though, because using one graph, you can't really tell changes over time. You'd have to compare more than one graph to do that. The most difficult graph we're going to talk about today is histograms. A histogram is a type of bar graph in which the categories are consecutive and equal intervals. I know that sounds kind of complicated, but consecutive just means in a row. So if we think about our data, we think about how our first interval, our first group, is from 1900 to 1910. The next group picks up right where it leaves off in 1910 to 1920. So if they're in a row, they're consecutive. It also makes sure that we have equal intervals. So each one of our intervals, each one of our time periods is 10 years, is a decade. The length or height, we're going to be doing up and down height, of each bar is determined by the number of data elements falling into a particular interval. So if we think about our data, the height is going to be determined by the number of people who migrated during that specific time. The first thing we need to do if we're going to make a histogram is to make what we call a frequency distribution chart. And this is, I know that's a lot of fancy words, but it's just a chart where we're going to record how frequently events happen during our interval. And this data chart is something you already should have. This chart helps us understand how many African Americans migrated to states in the north and the south. If we take a look at our increments, we have 1900 to 1910. Then 1910 to 1920, and 1920 to 1930. Pay special attention that we have people going to the north, so these are positive numbers, but the people are leaving the south, which makes these negative numbers. That's tricky. The next part for our histogram is to turn our frequency distribution chart into a bar graph. Remember, since the intervals in our graph are consecutive, they need to touch. So if we look at Illinois, these touch right up against each other. They shouldn't be spread out. This is different from a regular bar graph. And then also remember that if our numbers are negative, they go below the x-axis. And if they're positive, they go above the x-axis. So if you're dealing with positive and negative numbers, you may want to remember that your x-axis should be in the middle. So if we look at our chart, we can tell in Illinois, from 1900 to 1910, we had the biggest growth, more than Michigan and Missouri. In 1910 and 1920, we're also in Illinois as the biggest growth. But things change over time, and by the time we get to 1920 and 1930, all of these other states are starting to catch up.